Hi, everyone. This is Aaron Larson, executive editor of Power Magazine, and you're listening to the Power Podcast. On today's episode, I'm joined by Jay Hakes. He's an author. He's coming out with a new book at the 1st of April titled Energy Crises, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Hard Choices of the 1970s. He's also served as the administrator of the U.S. Energy Information Administration during the Clinton administration, and he was a director for research and policy for President Obama's BP Deepwater Horizon Oil Spill Commission. And another position he held was 13 years as the head of the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library, during which time he had some access to President Carter's private diary. So he really had inside information into things that were happening during the administration. And I know he's done a lot of research on Nixon, listening to tapes and different things. So, Jay, I welcome you to the program, and I look forward to talking to you. Is there anything I've missed, anything that it would be important for listeners to know about you?
Well, thanks, Aaron, and I think you've hit the highlights, so I think that'll tell people a little bit what I've been working on.
The first thing I'd like to talk a little bit about is what was happening back in the 70s. I was alive during that time. You know, I remember seeing some of the lines of people getting in gas lines, but you can add a lot more history to that. So what can you tell us about the 70s and some of the decisions that were made back at that time?
Well, I would argue, and I think a lot of historians would agree with me, that the 1970s was the most important decade in U.S. energy history. And I say that because of the gasoline interruptions. We had 3 big crises in the Middle East that reduced our supplies of oil. And that got so bad that at one point in some states, less than 50% of the stations had any gasoline to sell at all. And so people who had to sometimes sit in line for 3 or 4 hours, or they couldn't get gas at all, people canceled their vacations to Florida. That's something that sticks in people's mind and needs to be a little bit better explained than it's been explained in the past. It was also a time where electric demand was expanding at a very rapid rate. There was a lot of optimism that nuclear would fill most of that void. But then we had the 3 Mile Island accident in March of 1979, which was the major nuclear accident in the country. I think the procedures that were put in place after 3 Mile Island were quite good in sort of guaranteeing that wouldn't happen again. And we had some natural gas shortages and everything. And at times, the public in the polling said, we think energy is the most important part, or most important issue facing us today. Those of us who work in the energy space probably feel that quite frequently. But for the general public to say, look, of all the issues that confront the country, energy is number one, you don't find that often. And that was the case sometimes in the 1970s. So I found it a fascinating area. I visited at least 6 archives working on it, going over things I thought other people hadn't looked at closely enough. I even went down to the AAA headquarters in Orlando because they had the weekly records of their survey of gasoline stations around the country, and that was the only place you could get specific data on where the shortages were. So it was a book I enjoyed writing, and I hope people will find the 70s to be of interest.
No, I absolutely love looking back at history, especially during times when there were crises and there were a lot of things going on behind the scenes. So can you explain a little bit about how the oil shortages were affected by particular policies, maybe particularly starting with Nixon? What was the relationship with the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, for example, at the time? Were there a lot of conflicts between the two nations?
Yes, there's a whole set of issues when Nixon was president, then there's a different set of issues when Carter was president. But, oil was discovered in Saudi Arabia in the late 1930s. And I think most oil experts felt that the United States was going to run out of oil at some point, and Saudi Arabia would be the place we'd go to get that oil. And just as Iran was sort of owned by British companies and supplied their needs, Saudi Arabia would someday do that for us. But we had import quotas because we wanted to protect our local industry, and we didn't want to be dependent someplace on the other side of the globe. So that worked until 1970 when our oil production peaked and then started to go down. And then we had to let the Saudi Arabian oil in, and then they were upset with our intervention in the war between Israel and Egypt. And so they and other Arab states put an embargo on us. So we had a huge drop in the oil that was available on the international market. They particularly embargoed the United States. And a couple of things in policy actually were counterproductive because Nixon put in wage and price controls and kept the price on government controls on oil prices. And the government took over the allocation of oil, which they had done during wartime, but to do it in peacetime was a pretty big move. And basically, they botched both of them. The price controls discouraged U.S. production. One little insight was they raised the price of gasoline each month based on the cost of the service station. What they didn't realize was if the price was going to go up the next month, at the end of the month, why would they sell it at a cheaper price if they could wait a few days and sell it at the higher price? So it just became kind of a classic case of where government shouldn't be regulating things that way. And now with Saudi Arabia, that is a complex issue because they were both good friends and they were our enemy. And we were selling them a lot of weapons and materials, agricultural products. And so we never severed the relationship with them. We kept having cordial meetings with them while our economy was just reeling at home. And that was true both in the 73-74 period, and then we had another reappearance of gasoline lines in the 1979. Eventually, Carter came to the conclusion that we had to decontrol crude oil prices. And that started us away from this area of over-regulation.
It's an interesting dynamic when you factor in all of the other things, that you can have them embargoing us and also being our friends and buying weapons and whatnot. How could they manage that sort of interaction? Were there different parties involved in the different aspects of these relations?
Well, there was some interest. Part of writing a book on history is to find the interesting personalities. And so you have a guy named Bill Simon, who was the energy czar. And Simon liked the Saudis and didn't like the Iranians, who was our other supplier of oil. But then Henry Kissinger, who was the Secretary of State and famous foreign policy advisor, he liked Iran and didn't like the Saudis. So there was this fight going on in the background about who was the better partner for us. And the idea was Saudi Arabia, with their oil growing, they had these tremendous reserves of cash. And so we were hoping they would spend it here, which in many cases they did. So there was a lot of interchange going around. And of course, at that time, too, it was the new Saudi leadership. A number of them had attended universities in the United States. The two most important people, one had gone to Princeton, the other had gone to Harvard. So it was interesting to follow. And what I found is the Americans often couldn't understand quite what the Saudis were saying. The Saudis would talk in a sort of we're your friends, and the Americans wouldn't hear what they were really saying. This happened both times. And so in both of the big oil shortages, the day that the Saudis cut their supplies, our people, including Nixon himself, walked out of the meeting celebrating because he thought they had said they weren't going to cut supplies. So it shows how, you get into those positions in government. You should know a little bit about oil. You should know about Saudi Arabia. And, there's a lot in the world to keep track on. Because of my interest in presidential history, I often point out what else was going on the same day that I'm talking about energy, because the president might have been juggling a dozen different balls that day. So you get a little bit sense of what it's like to be in the White House and be faced with some of these big decisions that you have to make.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I'm sure there are so many things coming at you. It's got to be the hardest job in the world. Now, was OPEC a big deal back in the early 70s, or when did OPEC really become kind of the maker of markets for oil?
That's an excellent question. OPEC was actually formed in 1960, and the Americans kind of scoffed at OPEC, partly because the American companies kind of owned Saudi Aramco at the time, and so OPEC didn't really have much clout. But its members did decide that they wanted to nationalize the oil companies, and so eventually the Americans lost their influence. And then this embargo, which was done for political purposes, they found out, hey, if we cut production, we actually make more money because the price increase per barrel produces more revenue than we lose by selling less barrels. So all of a sudden, OPEC went from being this, nothing in terms of the world market to being everything in the world market. And, its meetings would be covered by the press, very carefully because, they could determine our fate. Now, I would point out that in the 1980s, we sort of defeated OPEC because we cut our oil use so much that they had to chop production. And so OPEC kind of fell apart. They didn't get control again until about 1999. And then when you had the fracking revolution here, which really begins about 2007, OPEC started to lose its impact again. But these events I'm talking about in 73 and 74 is the time when OPEC really sort of developed its muscles and it could almost dictate the world price by controlling production levels.
And you mentioned, obviously, the accident at 3 Mile Island. What was that like? I imagine when you go back through the records of President Carter's private diaries and whatnot, I'm sure that had a lot of information of what was taking place. How did he react to what was happening at that time?
Well, that's another great question because, I mean, this is almost too good to be true. I mean, Jimmy Carter worked for Admiral Rickover when they developed the first nuclear submarine. So he actually knew the technology of nuclear reactors, obviously better than any president and better than some of the people that worked at the Atomic Energy Commission. So, and then the first accident in North America was in Chalk River, Canada, back in '53, and Carter was one of the group that was sent into the containment vessel to clean it up. So he's probably been radiated more than almost any person alive in America today, and he's 96 incidentally now. So he would be the best president you want to have if there was a nuclear accident. So he gets a call early in the morning, and the first few days they don't quite what's going on, and by that time it was the Atomic Energy Commission had been replaced by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and so the first couple of days he's getting his reports. He thinks it's probably okay, and then the third day, which I believe was a Friday, he comes to the conclusion that they don't know what they're doing, and he says, "Get me somebody who can talk, with me and knows the technical details." So he set up a direct phone line with a guy named Harold Denton, who was his on-site guy, and he was the head of nuclear reactors for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and they finally got a hold of it. And the short story is the coolant system, which keeps the core from melting, broke down. But the containment vessel, that 4 feet thick concrete structure that is around the reactor, did its job, and so very little contamination reached the public. So he formed a commission afterwards called the Kemeny Commission, which recommended reforms. And I think that commission did an excellent job. My only problem is Carter told them that they had to finish in 6 months, which is not a long time for a commission like that. And when we had the oil spill commission, we said, well, how long do we have? And they said 6 months. That's what Carter gave the Kemeny Commission. So that's become kind of the model for future investigations. But I think that was a case where some mistakes that were made that you said, well, they shouldn't have been made. But then afterwards, the industry and the government both did a good job of fixing those safety problems. So, in that sense, it's a good model for dealing with energy crises.
Yeah, I think all of the accidents that have happened, including Fukushima, most recently back in 2011, a lot of lessons have been learned through those incidents. And although they're terrible and horrific in their own sense, I think the nuclear industry has become much safer as a result of these lessons that have been learned. So that's a good thing going forward.
Yeah, we actually, on the Oil Spill Commission, we called in the Institute for Nuclear Power Operations. It is sort of the industry group that promotes safe practices and does an excellent job. And we called them in to talk about what their advice would be for offshore oil wells. And they actually had excellent input in terms of risk management and how you prevent breakdowns and things like that. So there's really kind of a connection of these things. And I agree with you. I think that, the corrections that needed to be made were made.
Speaking of corrections that may need to be made, in Texas, of course, we just had the rolling blackouts in mid-February. Can you talk a little bit about their system and anything that from your perspective should potentially be changed, or even perhaps, what led to the system breakdown that they had when the cold weather struck?
Yeah, in some ways, I felt like I was back in the 1970s again, because some of these errors that were made in the 1970s about how much oil we had access to, I've argued we wouldn't make today, because you have the Energy Information Administration, which didn't exist when Nixon was president. And, they do a good job of keeping public officials and the general public and the press alerted to what the data is. But when you look at Texas, it's another one of these things where it's hard to believe some of the mistakes that were made. I mean, the latest one that came out in the last couple of days was that the gas producers were eligible to get special treatment and access to electricity, because if they got cut off, then they couldn't provide the natural gas that the electric generators needed. Well, what happened was there was a form that the natural gas producers had to fill out to get exempt status, but a big chunk of them didn't fill out the form, so they were cut off. So that would seem to be the most illogical thing that you would could think of, and it's led to one of the things that led to the breakdown of the system. Another one was trying to cut it close on excess capacity, and just assuming that the market would take care of it. And, I was at EIA when the retail deregulation of electricity was coming in some places in the late 1990s. And I kept saying, you need to look at oil markets, because you say, okay, we'll control supply and demand by prices, because then when you get high prices, you'll get more supply, people will cut their use. And I said, when that happens in the oil industry, they call that windfall profits, or they have all sorts of bad names that they call it, gouging the public. And every politician, no matter what their background is going to say, you can't charge prices like that. So, the weatherization is kind of the first thing that most people mention. It doesn't get cold that often in Texas, but if you look at how crucial electricity is to the life, I mean, how do I charge my cell phone? I'd like to be able to heat and cool my house. So in retrospect, you say, well, why were they cutting that edge? And I think what the overall picture was that there wasn't a reasonable, coordinated regulatory structure. I think when we deregulate, we have to be careful we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. And so there needs to be some oversight that somebody's checking to see are the natural gas producers on the list for getting electricity in a breakdown. Because, the electric industry also in the Gulf Coast area runs is pretty vital to the operation of oil refineries. Mm-hmm. So, our oil shortages of the future might be more dependent on the reliability of electricity supplies than they are in Saudi Arabia, because we don't import much from Saudi Arabia anymore. So, people have to get a historical perspective and then look at, well, how have things changed and what do we need to be looking for if we want to avoid big problems in the future.
Yeah. One thing that really actually puzzles me is how many different systems there are in the U.S. You have some areas that are completely deregulated. You have other areas that may be deregulated in some aspects, but not in others. And then you still have areas that are virtually set up the way they used to be, where it's a monopoly and vertically integrated power companies supplying the generation, distribution, transmission, everything. So which of these works best? Should the market actually be deregulated, or what do you think, from your perspective, would be the most ideal way to operate our U.S. grid?
I think you always need a mixture, because it's possible to have under-regulation and over-regulation. Some of the areas for regulation are justified by we need to have environmental standards. Okay, so the government needs to say this is the level of pollution that we will allow, and you can't go above that, or we're going to charge you for your pollution, or some system in place. The other thing that markets generally don't do a real good job of is security and taking into account long-term factors. Like, in the oil side of it, what are the downsides of being dependent on Saudi Arabia for our oil supplies? And you might end up paying the same price for a barrel of Saudi oil as you do for U.S. oil, but the U.S. oil is more valuable because it's more reliable. And so electricity is somewhat a rough analogy. Then I think most of us would be willing to pay a little bit more to know that the electricity was always going to be there. And our refrigerators weren't going to shut down and you have to throw away all the food, or in some cases it's life-threatening if you can't, if you're using a heat pump and you can't, and it doesn't work, and it's cold enough, that's not a good situation. But then, if the government gets in too much, they gum it up, because whether you're talking about running an electric grid or you're talking about running an offshore oil well, there's a level of expertise involved that the government doesn't have. We did a study of one of the wells off of Louisiana and Texas, and just underwater, they had something like 14 different kinds of engineers had to be involved. I mean, we made the judgment that it was more complex than the mission to the moon, or a lot of things that we think are really high-tech science. Now, in electricity of the future, running grids is going to be complicated because you've got a lot of different sources of fuel. You have the problem of cybersecurity. And so the government's going to need to come in and set rules and have standards and hold people accountable. But that grid management also involves an incredible amount of expertise, and maybe the government has to realize that a lot of the expertise is in the private sector. So there's no easy answer to your question, but I think the worst thing is to be ideological and say that everything's solved by a free market, or to say everything would be hunky-dory if the government was running everything. The truth is unfortunately more complex and somewhere in between.
Mm-hmm. Another area that the government tends to get involved in is with subsidies and support for different technologies, and we've seen that, to be an important role for the government in certain situations when they're trying to get industry started, such as when solar and wind kind of needed those subsidies to kick them along and get the wheels in motion and get the economics of scale in place. What do you see happening going forward? For instance, I've seen nuclear plants struggling because of not getting priced for their carbon-free energy, not getting paid for that. What do you think needs to be done, or is there anything that needs to be done to keep these nuclear plants viable or support other types of technology along the way?
Yes, there should always be a recognition in the pricing that it's just not what you can get the cheapest. It's what's secure and good for the environment. Incidentally, this is it takes me a long time to write books, but I'm already working on my next one, and I get into this argument because I don't know if you might be familiar with the Oak Ridge Lab, for instance, and Alvin Weinstein, who was one of the great nuclear scientists. He was arguing when Carter was president that the coal industry was getting a free ride because the coal was starting to come in cheaper than nuclear, but because of climate change, nuclear needed to be, helped a little bit, or that needed to be taken into account in the calculations. So that's been something people have been thinking about for a long time. In terms of the future of nuclear, I'm kind of an independent thinker on this. I was on a study commission in the 1980s looking at nuclear because we hadn't ordered a nuclear plant for a long time. And we suggested in this report that the nuclear plant of the future should be smaller for a number of reasons. One is it would reduce the construction time. It would also allow you to mass produce some of the parts, which would reduce costs. They could be prefabricated. And then you learn by doing. So you'd be building more of them and you'd be bringing the price down. If I was writing that report today, I would add the ability to turn on and off more easily. The French plants tend to be more flexible than ours in that respect. And so now we're running into all sorts of problems where you have intermittent power with the wind and solar energy, and it's hard to pair those sometimes with the nuclear plant. Sometimes the nuclear plant's running all night as a base load provider, and you got this must-take wind coming onto the system. So we need to work those things out, because if we're going to deal with the climate change problem, we're going to need most of the current plants to keep running for a good while. And I think we will be better off if we are able to marry the intermittent renewable energy with a good set of new nuclear plants. And I think the smaller, more modular plants would be the answer to that.
Mm-hmm. I think my last question for you, and maybe you'll have something else to add, but I'd like to talk a little bit about what you see happening now with President Biden in office and with his energy policies and what the future holds and how it might shift from where we were headed with President Trump. Can you talk a little bit about Biden's strategy and where you see that being either positive or negative?
Yeah, I think it's been misunderstood by all sides. He's kind of buffeted on one side by some people that think energy production shouldn't have to follow any environmental rules, and then on the other side by people who almost seem like they want to shut down energy industries for environmental purposes. And I think neither of those approaches work very well. What he has done in actuality is that he's put a pause on leasing on federal lands. And so that doesn't affect production, at least for several years. It doesn't affect permitting of land that's already been leased. And there was so much leasing at the end of the Trump administration that most oil companies have plenty of locations available to them. So the pause doesn't cause a big problem in the short run. The question is what happens after the pause. And I would say that on the other side of the coin, everybody talks about fracking, but fracking is basically the technology that's used on private lands. And most of the federal lands or a lot of the federal lands are deep water rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. So his stop of federal leasing doesn't really affect private lands. And he said that he wants to continue the fracking. Where I think the environmentalists get confused is they think, well, if you shut down an oil well here, you've helped the climate. Well, if people are still using oil, they're going to get it either from the private lands or they're going to import it from abroad. So the level of pollution, of carbon dioxide pollution, is going to be the same. So I wish Biden wasn't under so much political pressure, because I think there is a middle ground on this too. I think for the economy, I don't think you want to stop leasing in places like New Mexico and offshore Texas and Louisiana, where there's a lot of jobs involved. And you're not really helping the climate if you stop drilling there, because the drilling will happen, in Saudi Arabia or wherever. So I think if he comes to that conclusion, and I'm writing some pieces kind of urging that middle ground, I think we'll be in good shape, because I think we've passed the point where we need to drill everywhere. We brought our net oil imports down from 60% to zero. Actually, we export more than we import. So that's an incredible achievement. And I think people are more aware of climate change today than they have been in the past. So there's going to be, increased emphasis on environmental values and what we're passing on to our grandchildren. But that doesn't mean we should shut down industries that are currently operating well. I think we need to regulate methane more closely, but most of the industry agrees with that. So I think there's a way for him to go, but I think it's too early to tell. I think now the Keystone Pipeline is a whole other issue that's very politicized. I think the impact of it, one way or another, is exaggerated, because that oil can also come by train if it has to. But we'll have to see. And Biden's under immense pressure, and I'm hoping he'll sort of come down somewhere in the middle along the lines that I've proposed.
Yeah. Well, I guess time will tell. We'll see what happens as things go forward. But Jay, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for going through and explaining a lot of the details from the 70s and getting your perspective on energy and nuclear power and all the other things we talked about. So is there any last words you'd like to have?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, and this was a great discussion. I was happy to participate.
Well, thank you very much. For listeners who want to check out your book, it's I saw it available on Amazon. It's Energy Crises, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Hard Choices in the 1970s by Jay Hakes. Thank you, Jay.